Hello and welcome back to the final chapter for our Characters in Production course. In this lesson we're going to be going over getting our character ready to animate in a final scene and actually animating a nice simple jump animation, predominantly to put this rig through its final test and get ready to hand it off to the actual animators in the team. It's been a number of hours since I started this tutorial series, but I'm pretty sure at the beginning we talked about using linking and appending to get our final animation up and running. I promised that I'd go into a little bit more detail on that, and now seems like the ideal time to jump in and just kind of explain a little bit more about how that works and why you really want to be using the linking option here. Very first thing that we're going to do is take our Suzanne file here. You can see that I've got this named as just Chapter 11. That just lines up with my tutorial series. What we really want to do if we were working in production, so instead of Suzanne Chapter 11, this would be called Suzanne_rig version 15 or whatever, however many iterations you needed to go through to get to this final rig here. Once you think that you've got your rig pretty much finished, what you want to be doing is going and saving kind of a master file for this character. So we're going to start by doing that. Let's go and call this Suzanne master rig _01. I'll just save it with the rest of my chapter files here. Ideally, what I would do, again in production, I'd create a new folder and I'd go Suzanne_rig, and I'd take all of these kind of progress files and I'd dump them all into that one folder. And I'd just have my master files for all of my characters and all of my scenes in this scenes folder. So I'm going to go and save this Suzanne master rig. And now we've got a nice clean scene that we can start with. We don't actually want to be using this scene here for our final animation. So I'm going to go and open up a completely new scene. So let's just go File, New. We'll just go with General. And as you can see now, we've got a completely blank, fresh scene. And this is where we're going to be doing our animation. We know that we're going to be animating with Suzanne, so let's go and link. You don't want to be using append here, they work a little differently. So let's go and link. Let's just go to our scenes folder, and I'll just list these so I can see them a little bit better. And I want my Suzanne master rig. And if we go into collections, you can see we've got this link_Suzanne. Remember earlier how I was saying it's really worth putting some sort of broad prefix in here so that because this is a fairly simple character. You could end up with 20 or 30 of these collections. Having one named link right at the very top makes this so much easier to just go, oh, that's the one that I want to link from library. And you can see that that's now brought in our character. I'm just going to go and quickly set this character up, and then I'll try and give you a little demonstration of how the linking works. But there's a few things that we want to set up here. You can see that even though I've got this link selected, if I try and tab, I can't get into our pose mode, which we're going to need to be able to animate. So there's a command that we need to run to get her, allow us access to that particular mode. I find this a little bit annoying. There was a keyboard shortcut in Blender 2.79, but they've taken that out. So the only way to get to it that I've been able to find is bringing up our search menu here, and if you just go make proxy, you can see that it doesn't have any keyboard shortcuts. Like I say, I find this a little bit annoying because, at least when it comes to animation, particularly animation in a production where you could have 10, 20 or 100 animators, this make proxy is one of your most useful tools in all of Blender. So keep a mental note of this. You're going to be using it a lot if you want to do a lot of character animation. So if we now go and select make proxy, it brings us up this option, and we can kind of make a proxy out of any of these. Again, this is why having really good naming conventions can be helpful, because again, this is a simple character. We don't have too many items in here, but we could have 100 or something. So if we just type in rig, you can see that we've got our rig _ Suzanne. That makes it really, really easy to find the 1 or 2 objects in your entire collection here, or in your entire linked collection here that you want. So we're going to go and select the rig Suzanne. You can see that this kind of pops over here, and now if I go into tab, you can see that I've got pose mode available to me. We can start animating this character again. Go and reset all of that. Now in terms of actually animating, when you try and click on Suzanne here, you can see that I'm now having a lot of trouble actually selecting her rig again. What I'm actually selecting over here is the link when I want to be selecting this proxy. So we can set this up so that this can be unselectable, and thus make it much easier for your animators. First thing I'm going to do is just going to go and drop in a ground plane here. Generally speaking, if you're working in production, in the same way that we've linked in Suzanne here, you'd link in your entire scene. That might be, a room or a burning building or whatever your assets happen to be. In our case, we're just going to go with a simple ground plane because this is really just a test animation. That allows me over here to go and create a new collection. So this first one up here, I'm going to call scene. This would be for my scene, my buildings, my ground planes, whatever it happens to be. And I would take both of these Suzanne assets and put them in a completely new collection. Name that collection appropriately. And I'm going to go and turn on our selectable toggle here. And I'm going to take our link here and make it unselectable. I'm actually going to go and do the same thing to the scene so that I can't accidentally select this ground plane. And now the only thing that we can select in here is our rig proxy, which just means that it makes it so much easier to jump in and out of animation mode. Other thing I'm just going to quickly go and do, you can see that if let's just move Suzanne out of the way a little bit here. You can see I've still got this empty kind of sitting in the scene for our link object. I find that really annoying. It can sometimes clash with controllers on your actual rig. So I'm just going to go down to our context here and I'm just going to shrink this down, basically down to 0 so that we can't see it anymore, and disable it again. And we'll just move Suzanne back into the middle. So let's just quickly talk about why we've gone ahead and linked Suzanne here. So first of all, let's save this scene. I'm going to go and create a new folder, and I'm going to call it jumping _ test animation. Really good idea to have solid naming conventions, both for your folders and for your scene names here. The way that I've generally worked is I go and create a folder for the name of the, let's say, movie. Let's say that we're making a whole movie here. I don't know, let's just say it was going to be like 4 or 5 different examples of Suzanne jumping. So we'd have a folder for the name of our movie, so that's jumping. We then go and call this jumping test animation _ let's assume that this movie had multiple shots in it and this was shot 01. And then just another little prefix because we may end up having multiple versions of shot 1. We may go and do our animation and then present it to a director and they may say, oh yes, that's coming along nicely, but could you just make her jump twice as high, for example? So then we might need to come in and create version 2. But this is the first shot, so let's call it title of our movie, which shot we're working on, and a version number. So we're just going to go and save that. So let's just say that we've gone through, we've done all of our animation, Suzanne's jumping nicely, and the client comes along and says, you know what, this is looking really nice, but I really like all these little fluffy bits that we've got on Suzanne. could we just add, a little fluffy curl to the top of her head? Give her just a little bit more personality that way. And we'd go, ooh, yes, we can probably do that, but we've got, 50 shots where Suzanne's being animated. And because we animated straight on our master file and duplicated that, we would now need to go through to 50 different files and go and add that little head fluffy curly bit to her on 50 different animations, and that becomes a lot of work. On the other hand, if you've used linking, let's just go and save this, and let's go and open recent. We'll go and open the master rig. All we need to do is go back to our master rig here, and I'm just going to go and make a little test piece here. We'll come back and delete this, but let's just say I wanted to grab a little cube here. Make sure that that's in the center. And I just made a little weird curly bit. It's looking absolutely dreadful at the moment. Just something a little bit like that, smooth it out. Delete that face there. And there you go, maybe you should need a couple of them to actually make them look like a proper little curl of some sort. So, just giving her some sort of weird little hairdo. So let's just say that we wanted to add that, and we'll go and join all of those and call them curl. We need to make sure that this goes under our geometry tab here. And obviously that looks ridiculous, but if we were doing this as part of a client request, we'd make sure that that was merged into our geometry here, and we'd rig it up so that it could, bounce or whatever. So now when I go and save this scene, and if I just go back to the jumping test animation, you can see that that little curly bit has been brought in. And if we had 50 different shots, that little curly bit would be brought in across every single animation piece that we've done. So rather than having to do that 50 or 100 times, depending on how many shots Suzanne is in, we only have to do it once. And that is a massive, massive time saver. So this is why we wanted to use linking. Use linking. It's very, very helpful in production. I'm just going to go back to this master scene here and delete that because we really don't want it. It looks silly. So I'll just save that again. And this is another thing. You can go in and you can take things off your character as well. So let's say that she, had a little jacket or something, some clothing that she was wearing, and the director said, no, we don't want that anymore. Monkeys wearing clothes, that's a silly idea. Let's get rid of that. So you could then come in and delete it, and you could go back to your jumping shot, and you can see that it's once again disappeared. This is the importance of linking. It's very, very powerful. Use it as often as you can. Basically, anytime that you need to build a rig, use linking. Okay, so with that rant over and done with, it looks like our rig is working quite nicely. I'm just going to go and jump into Look Dev mode and just double check that all of our textures imported across. It looks like they have, but our eyes are behaving a little bit strangely. That's got nothing to do with our rig. That's just because we created a new scene here and we don't necessarily have EV set up correctly. So just go to Screen Space Reflections and turn Refraction on, and you can see that we're getting our eyes working properly. So for this, I'm going to jump over to the Animation tab. And you see this just sets us up with the dope sheet rather than the timeline editor. If I just jump back here, you can see we've just got our timeline over here. Dope sheet just gives us access to a few additional tools. There's two different ways that you could set all of this up. This screen is generally used for being able to orbit around your character and do the actual animation. And this one here you usually set up as your camera view. I'm just going to go and set up a camera as a bit of a demonstration. Make sure that we go over to view and change lock camera to view so we can set this up properly. So this is a fairly simple scene. We're just going to have our camera sort of sitting about here, making sure that we can see the ground for when she lands on her jump, and then a little bit of extra headspace so that she's got room to jump into. And I might change this to look dev over here as well. So that's one way that you could potentially work. In our case, our camera view, since this is a test animation, our camera view is not quite as important. So I'm actually going to use this window to set up our reference footage. So I'm going to go and change this to the video sequence editor. I'm going to change this from sequencer to sequence and preview so that we've now got the actual spot where our clips will go and a preview window. We're going to go to this little menu here and go add movie. And if you go to the reference folder, you can see that I've got a jumping_reference file set up. So if we just go and open that, you can see that it looks absolutely terrible. And that's because this preview window is using our resolution options over here. So you can see that if I was to crank up the Y quite a bit, we can get that, making it look like I'm not quite so chubby. So a quick way of setting your resolution to match this this footage over here is to just go strip, movie strip, set render size, and that will automatically update this over here. And you can just see that it's essentially HD, so 1920 by 1080. It's just been flipped. So we don't need to use this resolution for our final render. We'll probably come in and change that, but just so we can kind of view our reference correctly, I'm just going to leave it like that, just for now. So let's quickly go over our footage. Just make this a little bit bigger. You can see that our timeline doesn't quite match our reference, so I'm just going to drag that out a little bit. Let's just do a quick preview of what we're working with here. We've just got a few different jumps. Now we're not going to do all three of these. I'm just going to pick one, and we're going to work off that. But it's always a good idea to try and get more reference than you think you will actually need. So don't be afraid about doing the same action, 3, 4, or 20 different times. Like, this is just a simple jump, but if you were having your character actually in some sort of a speaking role where they had to show a particular emotion or whatever, make sure that you get good reference and repeat it over and over and over again until your reference is strong in the way that you want it. As I say, this is fairly simple here. So I'm just going to have a quick look at these animations here, this reference footage here, and kind of pick the jump that I like the most. This was my first one, and then I was still kind of figuring out what I was doing. We're kind of getting a weird arm bend here, which I just don't think looks all that natural. We might avoid that one. This second one here, you can see my arms go really, really straight, whereas in this first one, hang on, let me just play that in real time. You can see that my arms go up and then come back down, and we're getting this nice kind of floppy, flapping motion with the arms. That's going to give us some nice overlap. Whereas in this second jump, they're very, very straight. It's a much more rigid jump. So I don't think I like either of the first two. This third one, on the other hand, I'm much more partial to. This starting pose is a lot more natural. We're getting a lot of flap and movement through the arms. That jump is nice and high. So I think we're going to go with this last part, this last jump. So let's go and sort of pick roughly where that starts. It seems to be about here. We're going to go and grab just a little arrow down there, so you can select the whole thing, or you can move the whole thing or you can just select the arrows and that kind of clips your movie. You can see it shrinking there. Let's use that. Let's go and grab it and move it back to frame 0. And that looks okay. And I think it... There we go. So it finishes on, looks like frame 100 exactly, which is somewhat convenient. Okay, so we've got our reference footage now. Let's talk about how we're going to animate this. So in animation, there's essentially two different schools of thought when it comes to animation. They're known as pose to pose or straight ahead. Straight ahead's the easiest one to explain. That's simply where you take your reference footage here and you go, so there's frame 1, and then you from the beginning and you just go through and you animate each individual pose kind of as you go. Just start at the beginning and run through it all the way to the end. And it's a nice kind of free-form flowing way of animating. It does have some disadvantages when you need to hit some very particular beats in your animation. So let's say that Suzanne here was actually interacting with the real world. Let's say that we wanted to put her inside real film and she needed to go up and, I don't know, shake my hand, for example. If we were doing straight ahead and this was like a 500 frame animation or something, we might have her walking onto scene and walking across the room. We might get to frame 500 where she's supposed to be shaking someone's hand, but because we've animated the walk cycle a little bit too slowly, the person she needs to shake hands with is over here somewhere, whereas she's only walked halfway across the room. This is where something like pose to pose comes in handy, because rather than going through and animating each individual little piece as we go, we pick out our major keyframes. So it might be at frame 1, it might be as she's in the air, it might be as she hits the ground, and we go through and we animate those 3 or 4 major key poses first, and then we come back and fill in any gaps. So this is really helpful when it comes to timing your animation, if it needs to line up with other things happening in the world, or music, or anything like that. Personally, I tend to use a little bit of a blend between the two. I like to go through and do my major poses first, and then come back and kind of do a straight ahead in between those major poses. So nail your major positions, and then come through and make sure that everything's kind of flowing nicely. You're getting this nice flap on the arms. So that's what we're going to do. So let's jump in and let's set up our major poses, our pose to pose first. So first thing that I want to do is grab every single one of our controllers. Let's just go back to frame 0 here, and I'm just going to key everything on the location, rotation, and scale, and just make sure that absolutely everything that we've got here has a keyframe. This is just really helpful because if we got up to, say, frame 50, and that was the very first time that we wanted to animate a particular body part, you'll notice that there's a lot of floating that can kind of happen between major poses. Another thing that I want to do is turn on our auto keying down here. This is certainly an optional thing depending on your workflow. I personally like having it on. It just means that when I go to a new frame and I rotate something, it automatically goes and keys that. Whereas if I have it off, I have to rotate it and then I have to manually go through and actually key it before it sits in, before we actually get our keyframe. So I'm going to work with it on, and let's set up our first pose. Now our first pose here is just kind of me standing there. I don't think it's particularly compelling. So what I'm going to do instead is actually go and grab one of these last poses, where it's kind of in more of a monkey sort of stance. The advantage of doing this is If we have our first and last pose the same, it means that we can create a looping animation, which will also be nice for a little test piece. So let's just go through here and let's mark out where our keyframes are going to be. So we're going to have this one at the beginning. We're going to want to have one kind of right at the bottom of the bend. You can kind of see here my hands, they're moving down, and about there is where they start to move outwards. So right there, we'll drop in a keyframe. Now to do this, I'm actually just going to add markers for now. Shortcut key is M, and then that'll also appear on our sequencer timeline. So that'll just make it a little bit easier to find exactly where those keyframes are going to be. Just zoom out a little bit. And we want another keyframe just as the feet start to come off the ground, which is right about there. Quite a bit of motion blur there, but we can work around that. And then there's another keyframe where the toes come off the ground. I think that should be about there. Just zoom this in a little bit so I can see these markers a little bit better. And then somewhere about there, you can see the wrist reaches its highest point and starts to come back down. So that can be another keyframe. We're essentially looking for anywhere where major motion changes or contact points happen, so like the feet either leaving or touching the ground. It's a nice little monkey expression going on there. And we can see right about there is where the feet reach their highest point and then start to come back down. So we'll have another keyframe there. And the next one is probably going to be as the feet touch the ground. So it looks like that's about there. They're possibly touching there, but that's really where the impact point seems to happen. So we'll go add another keyframe there. We've only got another frame or two, and you can see that then the heels hit the ground as well. So it's probably only going to be a couple of frames in between those. About there seems to be where the hips stop going down. And then about there is where they go up again. You can see there's this nice little bobbing sort of action that happens. So it goes up and then back down slightly, which seems to be about there, before going back up and holding at about frame 90. And then there's just a little bit of floaty sort of stuff happening there. So we'll no doubt have another keyframe at the end, which will match our keyframe at frame 0 here. Okay, so we've got our markers all set up now. Let's actually go through and start putting in our major poses. Now, one of the new tools that I've only discovered in the last couple of days is a mirror pose tool. Now, you'll see that we can't actually see it anywhere here. We're going to need to go under View and Tool Settings. You can see we get this extra little dock here. If we turn on X Mirror, or just tap that button there, it does the same thing. You can see now if I go in here and let's just grab a foot, for example, you can see everything's moving symmetrically. So that's really cool. It's not something that we want to overuse, otherwise we'll end up with this process that's known as twinning, which is basically where both sides of the body move at exactly the same time. And that just, it's kind of similar to having a perfectly symmetrical face, which isn't so bad with our Suzanne character here because she's all cartoony, but the more realistic you make your characters, the more asymmetrical you need to make their faces. So that might be as simple as putting a scar on the left cheek or something. That's kind of a bit of a video game trope, and that's to sort of help break up symmetry. So in the same way that we don't want that with facial expressions, we also don't want that in animation. I'm going to use this X mirror just to kind of get started and knock out a few of our major poses, and then after that I'll come back and turn it off. We can sort of refine things a little bit. So as discussed, I don't really like this first pose all that much. I'm actually going to just go and drop straight down to frame 100, and we're going to try and copy this pose a little bit. So I'm just going to go and drop this into front view for a moment. Pull Suzanne down a little bit. I'm going to want her knees to be splayed somewhat. Rotate the feet outwards just a little bit. Go back to the front view. And we can then spread them a little bit wider. They look like they basically match up with the knee. So somewhere about there. I'm going to want to put just a little bit of rotation through the spine here. In fact, let's just go to the side view. We're going to need everything to sort of push forward just a smidge. Do the same thing here, tilt that forward, and then let's just go and drop over to individual origins. We can grab the neck and the head at the same time and rotate both of them. And as you can see, we've encountered our first problem. Let's see, is this the neck? The neck's doing a little bit of it, and the head is also doing a little bit of it. This is why we want to do our test animations. So let's jump back into our previous file. Actually, let's just get this head and neck a little bit nicer before we do that. So we know that this is happening on the tail. So I'm just going to go and save this scene. I'm going to go back to our master rig over here. Go into pose mode, and we know that it's on the head and the neck. So let's just rotate those. Let's just kind of push them fairly extreme. And now we're going to need to go into the weight paint and figure out what's affecting this backside. So I suspect that it might be these eyelids, and in fact it looks like it's the jaw, but some of these new bones that we added previously. So let's just go in and remove any weight from there. And it looks like that's all it was. It was a fairly simple fix in this case. So let's just reset Suzanne and save. Now when we go back to our jumping animation, you can see that tail has been fixed. So this is why we want to use our linking. Let's just say that nobody noticed that little mistake and we'd done another 2 or 3 animations. That would be a real pain to fix. that kind of neck area. So I'm just going to pull that up. Pull that up. You can see that we're also starting to get this little bit of weird lumpiness going on in here. That looks like it's a rigging problem. I might go in and correct that in a moment. Let's just sort of finish off this pose a little bit. Let's just keyframe everything. I just want to check. The feet still basically stay planted, so that's okay. I just shift the knees in a little bit more. I might just start tilting her head back. Okay, so again, I'm just going to go and save this scene, go back to our master rig. I'm going to go and grab our shoulder here. Let's just rotate that up. That actually doesn't look too bad there. It must be, once we start getting here, yeah, that's where you can see the pinching starts to occur. So let's go into weight paint, and this is probably going to be our arm. So we get past all of our fingers and toes and everything here. There's our legs. So this is... Oop, there we go. I think I just saw it. Shoulder. Kind of want to work on the left though, just so I can see this a little bit better. And there you go. You can see that these both need to be smoothed out a little bit more. So let's go back to our blur tool, make sure that everything's set the way that we want it. Let's just blur that out a bit and go to the upper arm. Do a bit of the same. Actually seems to be pulling things away, so I might just go and add a little bit more. Smooth that. I might add a little bit more up here. Just until that starts to look a little bit smoother. I want to be careful not to take it too far up that arm. Starting to get some interesting results. Just going to turn my wireframe on so I can see that a little bit better. It's getting a little bit of weird lumpiness in there. I'll just try using my average tool. Kind of seems to be helping. And then I think one more blur over the top of it. Fix that up. Pull all of this up through the neck just a little bit more. Just around this side. There we go. I think that looks much better. Okay, let's go and reset all of that. Make sure I'm doing the shoulder as well. We can save that and go back into our jumping animation. And you can see that that's helped get rid of that weird little bit of lumpiness there. Seem to be losing just a little bit of mass kind of in around this armpit. I actually might just quickly jump back in here. Just put this back. Raise that to about there and raise that much more. I'm just going to double check the armature here, preserve volume. You can see that that pumps it up quite a bit. Might actually be a little too much in this case. I'm going to see if I can fix this with weight painting by itself first. So, upper arm. blur this out a little bit so it starts to just grab a little bit more going down there. I think that's a bit better. Save that and drop back to our jumping animation. And that looks okay. Alright, let's keep going. What's going on here? These seem to be locked for some reason. These ones work, which is good, but we obviously need to have control over these joints at some point. That's definitely a rigging mistake, so let's just quickly save this scene. Let's go back to our master rig again, and let's see if we can't figure out what the problem is. This is obviously a problem with the toes, so let's jump straight down here. I'm guessing it has something to do with the constraints that we added. That's definitely not working, whereas in that one is working and rotates that as well. So I'm just going to do a quick comparison because we've basically copied this from the fingers, which came with the Rigify rig. So if we just kind of look at these, we can see that on the fingers it's only working on the one axis, so we don't necessarily need the Y and the Z turned on. And I think most importantly, it has the offset selected, which we've forgotten to turn on here. So I'm just going to start by turning those off, turning the offset on. You can see that does kind of automatically snap it, which has given us some automatic values. So if I just go and reset that, we should now be able to rotate that slightly. And if I grab this, there we go, we can still rotate that. So I'm just going to go through and make sure that all of the offsets are correct, and then we can get back to animating. So let's just test everything. Good. Grab this, turn the offset on, set on. In fact, I wonder if I can do these at the same time. Does that work? No, it doesn't seem to want to work. Fortunate, that would have saved heaps of time. No, holding down Alt on that does not copy that across to everything else. Last one, and then I'll just quickly test all of them. In fact, I can certainly grab all of these at once and rotate, and they all work. Those all work. Let's grab all of those. Go. Actually, these appears to be just a little bit more. That one works. That works. What's going on there? No, that's okay. Maybe I accidentally had that one selected at the same time. Okay, that seems to have given us back control over our toes, so I'll just save this and drop back to our animation shot. And now, if we go into pose mode, we should be able to grab all of those, rotate on the X. Doesn't seem to be working. Hold on a second. I've just reopened that, so it should have automatically refreshed. But if for some reason it doesn't, you can come over to your Blender file tab over here, find your master rig, whatever your rig happens to be called, and you can go and reload that. It does not seem to have copied those across, which is a slight problem. This can be one of the slight issues with using linking. Generally speaking, you can get everything across, but every now and then you get something like this where it doesn't want to work. What's interesting is usually this sort of stuff gets locked down, so the fact that I can come in here and control this with a linked object is actually a little bit odd. I might just try, rather than reloading it, which just kind of refreshes the scene, I'm just going to try and relocate it and see if we can't load the whole thing in from scratch. And that gives us all sorts of error warnings. Let's see whether that's actually fixed anything. And even that doesn't seem to have fixed it. So we've essentially got two options here. We can either go in and do this manually, which will give us back that control. That's one way of dealing with it. Considering that this is very early on in animation, it seems to be unlikely to cause any other issues. That's something that we could do. But while I've got this opportunity where things have gone wrong, I thought, I'm thinking maybe I can use this as an opportunity to show you how I would fix this in production. If, let's just say, for example, that I'd run into this exact same problem where this wasn't allowing me to rotate, these offset options hadn't updated, and this this bone constraint here was in fact locked down, and I couldn't go in and make any changes. So what I would do under those circumstances, I would go to my rig, I would grab every single controller that's got a keyframe on it. Let's just go and make sure that everything is keyed on both the first and the last frame here. And let's just go with all of our keyframes selected and just go copy. Now it doesn't really give you any feedback to say that it has copied, but with a bit of luck, it will have copied. So now we've got all of these keyframes saved into our copy buffer. What we can do is come down here, we can delete our asset out of our link library here. Just go back to view layer for a moment, because occasionally you will get some data that gets left over. Let's just make sure that it's selectable. And yes, we do have it selected. We just made it really, really small. That's why it's hard to see. I'm just going to delete that. What I'm going to do is relink original Suzanne rig in. Oh, she goes and shifts over there because that's where we had our 3D cursor set. Not to worry, we can just zero out her transforms and get her back here. We're going to have to remake her into a proxy. And that'll give us all of this back. Let's just go and move the camera out of there and put that under scene. Now if we go into pose mode, first of all, let's just check and make sure that these have now worked. And you can see that we've got our offset selected there, and we've now got control over our toes again. Also just going to go and make sure that our rig is set to be in front so we can see everything a little bit better. Now you select everything, again selecting all of your controllers. Now you can't just go and paste straight in here, it tends to get a little bit upset with you. First you have to give it something to paste into. So first things first, let's just go and add a location, rotation and scale keyframe to everything. And now if we go and make sure your mouse is over the dope sheet here and go paste, you can see that it's gone in and pasted all of our keyframes back on top of our rig. And everything animates, thankfully, as expected. So that's good. We've got all of our animation back, and we've still got control over our toes down here. So now we can get back to animating. just realized that I don't have X pose turned on. X-axis mirror for pose mode here. Presumably that's because I opened and closed some scenes. So let's just make sure. I'm just going to have to go through, grab all of these controllers here, and just kind of very lightly shift them ever so slightly. And that should, hold on. There we go. That should go and re-keyframe everything. Let's just make sure that we've also got the heel done. About there. Okay, select everything and rekey everything that's available. Okay, that was a little bit of an annoying workaround, but at least an opportunity to show you how you fix things when things break. So that's irritating, particularly when it happens, in the middle of a recording, but hopefully an opportunity for you to learn how to fix things when it doesn't go to plan. So now that we've got that all fixed, I'm just going to give this a quick save before we move on to our next keyframe. Okay, so let's just zoom in here. We've just got to frame 28, which is just before the takeoff. So our next keyframe will be well into the jump. That's where really start to look like a monkey. So let's go and grab the middle controller. We want to move this up quite a bit. I'm also going to grab the feet. So the next thing I want to do is try and figure out what's going on with these arms here. You can see that that one on the right there is going up significantly faster. Doesn't seem to be a good reason why. Both seem to have keyframes at the same spot, and yet they work very, very differently. So let's jump in and try to fix that. I'm actually going to go and hide my reference here, just because having my screen capture software, plus having this in look dev mode, plus having a video playing is all kind of just slowing the system down a little bit. So this should, yeah, that's much smoother. So to be able to figure this out, I think I'm going to need to jump into the graph editor. Let's just have a look, see. Actually seems as though a fair bit of this is happening on the clavicle. I'm also just going to go and bring back the dope sheet just so I've got both of these to be able to look at. I'm going to check our values here, and you can see that at the moment they're exactly the same, just reversed. So it seems as though this is happening on the shoulder controls. And that seems to be where this problem is. They're the same here, except reversed, so that's perfect. Once we get here, they are quite radically different. Okay, so we need to figure out why that is. Okay, let's just go and have a look at some of these. So I'm just going to hide all of our controls just because having all of them there gets a little bit confusing. I'm just going to go and clear the keyframes on our location and scale just because we don't really need them at the moment. And that'll just give us these three curves, so that just makes things a little bit easier to look at. So this is kind of, seems to be wrong on pretty much every axis, so let's just go and have a look. Just center everything there. Just going to grab this section here and zoom in on it. And it's between these two keys, so the x-axis just rotates downwards. And let's do the same on this arm. Let's just have a look at the Y. Seem to be just largely inverts of each other. Looks like the problem might be predominantly on the Z. Okay, so I'm just going to go and try something. Ultimately, what I want just having a look at this and trying to figure out which one of these do I like more. That one goes up faster, that one goes up significantly slower. I actually think I like the animation on this side a little bit better. So let's just try copying these values over. Let's see what we can get here. Fairly sure we want the X to be, oh no, we actually want the X to be the same, I think. And we can just compare this with our clavicles here. So the Y needs to be inverted. Let's just go negative. And then the Z is where there's going to be a significant difference. Now, does that need to be, that also needs to be inverted. So just go negative. There we go. Now if we go between these 2 points, you can see that that's working. So this looks like it's just a case of some values in here that have kind of rotated a little too far around, and then they've been compensated for on a different axis. So we just wanted to make sure that those were kind of following the same pattern. So I'm happy with that. We're going to get something really weird. We should get something really weird happening between these keys because that changes so dramatically. Just going to go and... There we go, that's fixed it. Now we're getting something a little bit more predictable. And then as we come down, that now seems to be following the right pattern. Okay, so it really just looks like one of those 2 keyframes. So let's just go and have a look at this. Just going to go and join that for a moment. Okay, cool. So just in terms of general movement, that seems to be significantly better. So I might just kind of work on the timing a little bit here, just because Suzanne's body shape, the length of her limbs, etc., is different from a human, or at least different from my proportions. So there's some things here that are just looking a little bit strange. Just going to go and grab another window over here, and we're going to go and put this on our text editor. Because we're using, we're no longer in the master layer, we don't have our to-do list, so I'm just going to go and create a new one here, and just go to do list, and let's just have a look at our animation now, and figure out some of the things that we wanted to tweak. So for this, I might just bring back our reference, just so we've still got something to compare to. Make sure that's set to preview, zoom that in a little bit, and hopefully this won't be too slow. Just zoom this in a little bit over here. Let's rewind this. Let's just kind of let it play through a little bit. I might even just move this camera around a little bit, just so we're kind of looking at it from the same angle. Just go view, relock that camera. Let's just bring it around so it's a little bit more front on. It doesn't make for the most interesting shot. This is kind of just fairly straight on, but it is going to help us with our reference. Okay, let's just relock that camera. So one of the things that's kind of bothering me the most at the moment here is these arms kind of, when they get to this high point, they seem to come down just that little bit too fast. It looks more flappy than they kind of get to a height and then gravity sort of takes over. It looks like they're being forced downwards. They just move a little too fast. Just do this in slow motion. You can see that, yeah, her arms are moving much, much faster than our reference over here. One of the first things we want to do is, so the hands come down too fast. Get a little bit of space at the top there. What else have we got? Actually, that's something I hadn't picked up on before. In the reference here, I'm really looking pretty much straight at the camera. She's looking down quite a bit, so we might do that. It's not quite the first frame, but it's kind of our first major keyframe. So we'll get that. I'm noticing here that the toes are still very much curled upwards. And you can see here, there's so much force coming kind of through the toes that they go from kind of curved, you know, kind of in that sort of a backwards C shape. And then they almost curve the other way, whereas in these ones are still curving in their backwards C. So I want to add a lot more bend to the toes there. okay. On this bounce, there's a lot more upward movement in the reference, so we might just have her come up more on that bounce upwards motion. It's not quite so bad. The rest of that seems to be okay. So I think that's kind of the major things, at least on this first pass. I think after we've done that, when we initially came through and animated everything here, we've had everything on X mirror. I might even just turn that off now, because that's creating that twinning effect where everything kind of moves at the same time. We're going to go through and we're going to remove the twinning and just kind of offset everything a little bit. So one thing that you can do, particularly on jumps, is to have one foot sort of come up first, as if it's kind of the driving force. So one foot will come up earlier, one foot will stay on the ground a little bit longer, and then you can kind of have the same thing when you come down. One foot can hit the ground first, followed by the other foot. That's one way to just kind of break up the symmetry. We're going to want to add the tail and ears animation, so that'll kind of be our secondary animation. Now that we've got our kind of base movement down. Another thing that we haven't done here is her eyes aren't really doing anything. They stay open for the whole time. One thing that beginner animators, when they first start, they just kind of add blinks and stuff sort of at random. And blinks are anything but random. They're largely involuntary. We don't necessarily choose when we blink, but they do sort of follow... blinks follow particular actions. So one thing that often happens is if you're having a conversation with two people and one's slightly off to your left and the other's slightly off to your right, the person on the left is speaking to you, so you're looking at them. And then if the person on the right starts speaking, you swivel your head around so that you can look at them. And that movement from the left to the right is generally a fairly quick and sharp movement, and people will usually blink when they move their head from left to right, just because if you're moving that fast and there happens to be some debris or something floating in the air and hits your eye, it can potentially damage it. So we often blink when we do any sort of fast head movement. Similar kind of things happen on impact points. So as Suzanne hits the ground here, I think we'll add a blink in there. So in fact, let's go and add that. Add blink on landing. So that'll be one point where, because there's such impact when we hit the ground and our head kind of rocks forward just that little bit, it's the same kind of principle as when we look from left to right. Our eyes kind of try to protect themselves, so they blink. And I think that'll do for our first pass. After that, I think we'll do another quick look over and see if there's anything else we want to change, and then we'll start moving on to cleaning up our animation curves. So let's basically just start at the top here and let's work our way down. So let's turn our control curves back on. I'll just drop out of camera mode so we can get over here a little bit easier. And it's going to go back to our dope sheet just because it's a little bit easier to read, and go, it's frame 17 that we want this on. So all in all, I'm fairly happy with the general kind of movement here. So I think in the next little bit we're going to go over to our graph editor down here and start just fine-tuning some of the movement here so that we get some slightly cleaner movement, particularly like through our arms and legs here. There's just a tiny little bit of jarring that's going on, and we can fix that in the curve editor. So I'm just going to rearrange this layout a little bit. Let's go and get rid of this because we've added our tail and ears animation. We're going into the polishing sort of phase now. I'll just bring our controllers back and just pull this up a little bit. Probably don't need the reference. I'll go and hide that so I can maximize this screen up the top. And let's go and change this to our graph editor. And let's make a start with the torso here, because that's kind of the main driving force of our animation. It's kind of the part of the body that's going to move first, so we want to make sure that that's looking good first. And I'm just noticing that I've still got this empty that's way too big, so I'm just going to shrink that back down so I don't get distracted by it. Alright, I'm still rather unhappy with how this is looking, and I was really hoping to avoid this, because what's going on here is a reasonably complicated issue. It's referred to as gimbal lock, and honestly it's really difficult to explain, which is why I was hoping to avoid it. But fortunately, we do have an option in here to look at our gimbal rotations, which is going to make it a lot easier to understand. So, as you've noticed, we've got a bunch of different ways that we can rotate our objects. At the moment, we're working with the local, which is, at least for animation, it's arguably one of the best ways of having your rotations set. But as you know, you can just you can go to global, and then that'll kind of use the world's coordinates. The thing is that neither of these are kind of what's going on under the hood, and this is somewhat related over here to our quaternions. But easiest way to understand this is if we just go into gimbal rotations, and you can see that we get very, very different rotations. So if I just go back to here, which is pretty close to our default position, you can see that we get something that looks a lot like our normal, our local rotations. But as we scroll through this animation, keep a close eye on the X and the Z rotations. And you can see that when we start rotating, most of this is happening through the Y rotation. It starts to move this X rotation closer and closer and closer to the Z rotation until we get to the point where they're almost on top of each other. In fact, if I was to just rotate this a little bit further, to about there somewhere, you can see we get to this scenario where we can no longer really rotate around this axis. The X and the Z have practically become the same rotation axis, which is why we're getting this weirdness as she throws her arm up, and you can visibly see it here, where it's around about through here, that the computer doesn't know whether we're trying to rotate upwards on the Z here, or as we push it a little bit further, it doesn't know whether now we're starting to try and rotate on the X-axis. And I've just kind of made a mess of our keyframes here, so I'm just going to undo a couple of times. So that's kind of what's going on under the hood. There's a lot of complicated math. I'm not going to bother trying to explain it because I only have a partial understanding of it myself. What I do understand is these two axes are causing us problems, and the computer doesn't know which one it wants us to use. So we're going to have to go in here and kind of tweak some of our keyframes and attempt to tell the computer, no, we want to be predominantly rotating on this axis. Try and use the other one a little bit less. So to do that, let's just have a look at this. So at least from this starting position, the way that I want this arm to be going up, I want it to be happening on the Z. And then we can use the X to kind of rotate it backwards. So as we go through this animation, what I want is to give the X-axis less control over our up and down and try to keep it on our back and forth. And that's predominantly happening on this frame. So what I'm going to do is using the Y-axis here, I'm just going to kind of rotate this back a little bit and try and put our X-axis back on this forward and back. I'm just going to kind of shift it there, somewhere around there, and you can see that already our keyframes are starting to move towards each other. That's ultimately a good thing. I'm just going to lower this down a little bit so that it kind of matches that other arm. Maybe push it forward a bit. And I think that's actually okay. Our elbow's kind of pointing backwards, which is what I want. I was thinking I might have to use the clavicle here to kind of rotate that a little bit further, but I'm fairly happy with how that's turned out. So let's keep going. can see this is where things really start to go a little bit belly up. Now, one other option that we do have is to select all of our keyframes, and if we just start typing Euler, E-U-L-E-R, we've got this filter that we can potentially use, and again, complicated math inserted here, but this will kind of go through and attempt to recalculate all of our keyframes here and try and put them, essentially try and fix all of this underlying math for us. Now, I sort of played with this before, and I don't think this is going to work for us. If it does, you'll see all of these keyframes will just sort of snap around, and you can see in this instance it hasn't worked for us. If these keyframes were a little bit worse, like you can see that they're fairly close together, but sometimes you'll end up with scenarios where, like, you know, the arm has completely flipped around like that, and those are the instances where that Euler filter can help us. But in our case, well, the plus side of the Euler filter not working here is that it does suggest that this isn't too bad. We can probably fix this manually. So as we did before, I'm going to push this back until we kind of get these all of our axes sort of roughly where we'd expect them to be. Now I'm going to push this back over here and then bring that back up through the shoulder that way. Now our elbow's still facing backwards here, which is nice, but we've kind of got our wrist snapped around the wrong way. So we can maybe fix a little bit of that by tweaking our collarbone. And we can also come in here and kind of rotate this around, but we have to be careful, otherwise we'll end up with the same problem over here. So we predominantly want to be rotating this in the X. As you can see, we're starting to get the same problem through the hand here. So I'm just going to go and reset these rotations for a moment. And actually resetting those gets us just about to where I'd like to be. And you can see over here, in fact, let's just undo this. When I reset these kind of flip back on each other. So instead, I might hold this wrist and I might see if the Euler filter will work here. Unfortunately, it doesn't. I'm just going to reset that and see whether that doesn't do anything. No, so we're still going to be stuck with doing this manually, which is a little bit of a pain. But at least now I can kind of see what's happening. This is, we'd rotated too far on the y-axis over here, and then we attempted to compensate by rotating too far on the y-axis over here. And because we'd rotated both of them too far, we were getting a bit of gimbal lock on both. So hopefully now we can kind of compensate for this on both, possibly even on the clavicle here. And between those 2 or 3 joints, we should get something that's fairly close to what we want. Just going to go and reset that. No, this one's not really doing too much. Just trying to be careful not to push it too far. Let's go and do a little bit more of this through the clavicle. Possibly push that back up through that way. I'm just trying to get this elbow a little bit more like this one over here, where it's starting to point downwards more than backwards, whilst trying to stay respectful to our potential gimbal lock here. I'll make this a little bit more visible, that bend through the elbow there. And of course we can always add just a little bit of rotation through there. I really want this wrist to kind of snap backwards a little bit. Okay, let's just have a quick look at that. I expect that this wrist is going to cause me issues because I can really see it's doing some strange things here. In fact, as we scroll through here, you can see that it really just snaps around. So let's turn these controls back on. I'm just going to go through and try to fix these keyframes around either side of it. You can see that one, these keyframes through here really go a little bit crazy. So let's go back to our shoulder here. Here we go. As we start to fix this gimbal lock, it's kind of going to mess up some of our keyframes a little bit after, because it was trying to compensate on the x-axis. Now we've sort of fixed the x-axis, but our z-axis is still trying to compensate. So we can kind of go back and push that to there. And I think, just looking at the graph editor here, that seems to have gone a long way towards fixing it. I think that's pretty close. Let's just have a look at this in real time. And I think that's good. As she lifts her arm here, we're no longer getting that kind of slow down delay. Everything's just sort of streaming nicely. I am still noticing somewhere near the end here. Yeah, right there. She kind of snaps her wrist in this strange way. I'll just look at that in real time. It's right there. She kind of curls her wrist forward. I'm going to suggest that that is a continuation of our gimbal lock problem, where the axes have been out of line, and then right at the end there, they try to go back to being normal. So just through here, it seems to be one of these couple of keyframes. It looks like that's through the wrist. Let's just go and have a look at these a little bit closer. They don't look terrible, but that keyframe where it's kind of laid back a little bit and then it moves forward. I'm going to suggest that maybe we don't need these keyframes. You can kind of see, particularly on the X and the Z goes up and then comes down, and the X goes down and then goes up. They're kind of weird inverts of each other. So I suspect that that might be where our problem is. Okay, it doesn't look like that's where our problem was. Doesn't look like that's where our problem was. But we still need to fix this. Just out of curiosity, if I delete that, it still seems to be there. I wonder if it's on the wrist at all. We've definitely got an extra couple of keyframes in here on the Z. Let's just remove that to start with. Perhaps this is actually on the shoulder and not on the wrist at all. That seems to have gone through a fairly big movement. That seems to have got rid of that kind of roll through the wrist. I still think we need a keyframe in there. It just wasn't that one that we wanted. So let's go to here. Let's go and add this keyframe in the same spot. Yes, and as you can see, these are starting to get dreadfully close to each other again. So let's just maybe roll this that way a little bit. And then pull it back up on the Z. Just sort of do something a little bit more like that, trying to keep our axes from overlapping each other. Sort of seems to have reintroduced our problem. So perhaps it's actually these keyframes that the problem is. So that's a little bit better. Our axes are kind of where I'd expect them to be, and now I can rotate on the Z instead of rotating across all of them. There we go. I think that's got rid of it. Just need to make sure you keep rotating things on that third axis, in this case our Y, so that these things just don't end up getting too close to each other. We can possibly compensate a little bit by just rolling that shoulder back, actually through the clavicle. Okay, let's go and have a look at that in real time. That hand looks good. Still seems to be a little bit of twist through about there. It seems to be unnecessary, but I think that might just be our animation rather than continuation of gimbal lock. So I should be able to just sort of roll that wrist back a little bit. That seems to be all that was. Again, just watch it in real time. And yeah, that doesn't seem to be twisting strangely anymore. The arm is definitely better. It doesn't lag. That's good. And then there's just a little bit of a bounce. And it seems to be a bounce, not a twist. Okay, so hopefully that whole bit there wasn't too confusing. Gimbal lock is the bane of an animator's existence. Another thing that you can do to fix it is coming in here and changing which Euler axis you're working on. Problem with this is that, so basically what this does is it changes the order of your axes. So here we've got the Y axis, and as we rotate that, it merges our Z and X. But if we were to just say, let's just pick one at random, you can see that that kind of switches them slightly. And as we rotate the Y now, you can see that it's no longer affecting our other two. But if we were to say rotate on that one, you can see that it affects the position of the Y. The only problem with doing it this way is that that can completely mess up our keyframes. Which in this case actually doesn't seem to have done a terrible job, but generally speaking, changing these halfway through an animation is a terrible idea. They'll sort of end up flipping in strange ways. You can see that as I change it, we get slightly varying results depending on which one we use. So changing this, you could have to completely redo your animation, or at least that controller. So if you can fix it while keeping the same Euler order, you'll save yourself a lot of headaches. But I'm happy with that. I think now that we've sort of gone and made some changes to all of these controllers to some extent, I'm going to have to go back through and just make sure that all of our curves are correct. Let's dive in and fix that up. So starting on the clavicle again, let's just work through this. So this is our up and down axis. So here things go up. That'll go down a little bit. I feel like that might be going down a little bit too much. Let's just balance that out a little bit with the other side. And it goes all the way up. Lags a little bit. And comes all the way down. This side looks alright, so it rolls forward a little bit. Hang on a second. So that rolls forward. Does that need to roll backwards? Forwards. I don't think this keyframe is doing much for us. Let's remove that. And then she throws her arms back. Don't need that keyframe. And we come back down again. I roll considerably forward and then go back and bounce a little bit. And finally, let's look at the Z. So this is the up and down here. So that'll go down. Is that doing much for me? I'll kind of delay a little bit before going up. And then coming back down. And I think here I might need to scale that a little bit. Oh, this is probably happening more over here on the X. Let's scale that a little bit further. That'll just help us get that slight delay. And then land. Okay, I think that's all right. Let's move on to the shoulder. That definitely needs a little bit of work. So again, rolls forward into it. And then see, we're just getting a little bit of a snapping going on through here. Just trying to figure out which of these keyframes do we not need, and maybe that we don't need any of these. Okay, so we clearly need some of those. So this is rocking it forward and backward. So I actually feel like maybe we don't need... Or do we possibly still have a little bit of gimbal lock going on here after all? These sort of seem to follow each other, which suggests it shouldn't be too bad. Let's just... I don't think we need that keyframe. We're definitely still swapping these axes over. You can see over here we're rolling up on the Z, and then by the time we get to here we're rolling up on the X. I wonder if maybe I've got the same problems here. In fact, yes, if I kind of move both of these, you can see that it's not really doing anything, it's just kind of wobbling back and forth. Let's just swap over to gimbal for a moment, and yes, you can see that that's definitely not working for us. So let's see what we can do about fixing this. Let's just go over here, and where do we want to rotate this? So I'm going to try rotating this forward some. think how I want this to work. It's really only kind of through here that things go badly. Let's just bring the Y rotation back in and see if we can't fix it instead. Just going to try rotating all of this down a little bit, and maybe grab all of this, pull it back that way. Yeah, okay, so I think we want to do that and then rotate. Oops, hang on, that's our elbow. We actually want our wrist here. I want to rotate that back in that direction. So it looks like we've got some similar problems to what we had before. Get that about there. We've only corrected one of those keyframes, so I kind of expect that that's going to go a little bit bananas, which is kind of to be expected. What happens if I just remove those keyframes? It kind of puts us back over here somewhere, which is actually not too bad. Let's just go and insert a keyframe here. See if we can't rotate this back a little bit. Or is this mostly happening through the wrist? Yes, I think this is mostly happening through the wrist. You can see. Let's just go and remove some of these keyframes so it's a little bit easier to see. You can see we're getting this where the Y goes here and then it bounces back and then it bounces back again. So if we just remove that one, we should get something that's pretty close to what we want. There's still a little bit of snapping going on there, but that's presumably happening over here now. You can see we're no longer getting gimbal lock, which is nice. Okay, I think that little bit of bounciness through there is now just fixing up our keyframes. Okay, I think that takes care of our fingers. I think the only thing left now is to get this tail working. Now this base of the tail was doing some extra stuff to our animation. We were just kind of using it to sort of offset everything a little bit more. So I'm going to grab these first. Again, let's remove the unnecessary keyframes. Oops, need to do that on all of our controllers. Clear all the keyframes. We can do that here as well. Okay, now we can select those ones. And let's just work through this. Make sure that I'm working on local so I can see this a little bit better. And this should predominantly be happening on the Z axis by the look of it. Let's just make sure that we've only got the X axis visible. Let's see what we can do about cleaning this up. Oh, hang on. I seem to have accidentally removed the rotations altogether off that one. Let's just go backwards a little bit. Okay, I've unintentionally deleted the wrong keyframes off here. Fortunately, I have a way to get that back, I hope. So let's just give this a quick save. And if I go File, Open, make sure that's saved. If we go over here to our little, what do you call these, filters, I suppose. If we click this second one, it shows us some backup files that Blender makes automatically. You can see that this has got a blend dot, or a dot blend 1 rather than just the dot blend. So if I go and open this one, you can see here I have a slightly earlier version of the animation. And if I go and check these, I can see that I've thankfully still got some of my animation here. So if I just grab this one and select all the keyframes, I should be able to just go Control C, which will copy everything. And now if I go back to our original file, I can hopefully grab this one. Let's just make sure that we've got keyframes on all of those. Doesn't matter what they are at the moment. If I now come down here and just go paste, it should go and paste all of those back in. And that's working again. I will just quickly save this so that I don't lose that again. Let's just double check. We've got rotations on everything, and I can clear the location and the scale, but not the rotation. Okay, let's select all of these again. Disable everything that we don't need, and we determined that it was the Z axis that was going to be doing most of our work here. So let's go through and start removing some of these unnecessary keys. Okay, I think I'm happy with that. That's put our rig through its full testing. Everything seems to be working now. So I think our final thing is, I'm just going to add one last little chapter at the end here, and we're just going to discuss some of the best solutions for rendering this out. So I will see you in the final lesson.